guys, it's the Red One here. Welcome to my Versus series. Now, I wanted to get on with this sooner rather than later, but unfortunately the day I was going to do it, I was very busy with a lot of other things and projects and things. And I didn't have, a lot came on that day, and I didn't have time to do it. And I wanted to make sure I had full time to do it, you know what I mean? Because I never like to rush my videos or projects, man. I want to make sure I've got all the time I have to do it, you know? So I did not have any intentions of rushing Leatherface and the UFC fighter, because this Versus series is something I've been looking forward to doing for a long time. So without further ado, here it is. So now, just before I go over this Versus match, I just want to go over a few things just beforehand. So always remember, guys, these Versus series are meant to be fun. You know, you guys can disagree with me or each other in the comments, but always make sure comments are left respectful. And, you know, because there's nothing wrong with people disagreeing with each other and having their own opinions, but just keep it respectful. You know, there's no need for any savageness, because I've seen some pretty savage comments in some videos. Not necessarily mine, actually, but, you know, in other YouTubers I watch that do, like, gaming videos, things like that, you know what I mean? And these Versus matches are all created by me. If there's any Versus matches I create with someone else, I will shout that person out as well and say it was created with him and me, you know what I mean? And yeah, just always remember, guys, as well, this is supposed to be fun, so let's keep it like that. Let's keep it fun, upbeat, and just talking about our scenarios, things like that, because I'm really looking forward to it. This is something I've been wanting to do for a while now. So the first Versus match we have is a UFC fighter versus Leatherface. Now, in these Versus matches as well, I'm not just going to be doing horror characters. It's characters from all different types of films against each other. Sometimes it'll be two horror characters versus each other. Sometimes it'll be two aliens, two demons, two entities. You know what I mean? It's every film, any film, characters against each other. Now, what makes Versus matches so special is that you can pick any character you want and put them against each other, because there's so many characters out there that we would love to see go against each other, but we never get to see it on the big screen. And I believe a UFC fighter versus Leatherface is one of them. It'd be a really cool film to make. And this is all written by me. One thing you probably don't know is I actually do write stories and scripts for certain characters to go against each other, and certain stories about everything. You know, about the originals, about the vampires in college, which was really cool. So I'm no stranger to writing stories. Let's just put it that way. Anyway, so this has all been written by me, and it's all my scenario as well. All this scenario about today has all been created by me. And always remember, guys, as well, you're on my YouTube channel, so try and be respectful. And remember that you're watching my video right now, so please enjoy. Okay, so without further ado, we'll get on with it. I just wanted to talk about a few things just beforehand. So, now, before we get into this, we need to decide what Leatherface I'm using. So, as you know, there's Leatherface from the original film, and then he continues into the sequel years later in like 2022 or 2023, I think it is. I've actually seen it on Netflix. It's not bad. It's okay, I guess. It's not the greatest Leatherface horror movie of all time, but it's pretty decent. And well, so the Leatherface I'm going to be using is, I'm not sure if you heard this in the short video, is the Leatherface from the 2006 prequel and the 2003 film Texas Chainsaw Massacre. That's the one I'm going to be using. I want to use the Leatherface from the 2000s film. He's probably my favorite. I feel he was the most intimidating out of them all, but this is just me, my opinion, so just remember that. I feel that Leatherface from the 2000s movie, 2003, and the 2006 prequel, I think he was the best. So I'm going to be using him, that Leatherface, for this Versus match. And that's just him. I'm not going to be using any member of the Hewitt family, whoever they are. I'm not going to be using any of them in this Versus match. Don't get me wrong, they might come into a part or a role in a future Versus series, in a future Versus match, but not this one. This one, it's just plainly 2003, 2006 Leatherface. Now, when it comes to a UFC fighter, I don't follow UFC or boxing or anything like that at all. But, however, I do know what it is. You know, anyone would know what UFC or boxing is, you know what I mean? You don't have to follow it to know what it is. But the problem is, I don't actually really know that many UFC fighters because I don't really follow it, like I said. So, in this scenario, I'm just going to call the UFC fighter a UFC fighter. And then you guys can decide in your own heads what UFC fighter it is in this fight. Because in this fight, I will be telling you who I think could win, and I'll be creating my own scenario. A scenario I created, but I'm not creating a scenario that I've just came up with on the spot. It's a scenario I've already written, you know what I mean? So, I'll be telling you who I think would win, and my scenario that I've written. Now, I will try and do... I don't have scenarios for every versus match, so some of them, they might be scenarios created on the spot. Not all of them will have scenarios, but most of them will. Now, also remember, in these versus matches, I might bend the rules a little bit just so a certain fight scenario can happen, but I will try and keep it as realistic as possible. I'll do my best, guys, to keep it as realistic as possible for if a fight actually did take place in real life. So, let's get started. So, who do I think could win? A UFC fighter versus Leatherface. Now, I believe the UFC fighter would win. I do believe the odds would be in his favour. Because you've got to remember, guys, a UFC fighter is a trained fighter. You know, they're skilled in martial arts and many other things. Submissions, headlocks, and of course kicks, punches, elbows. And I bet, I'm not sure if they're allowed to headbutt in UFC matches, but I bet they can even do that really well. So, when it comes to fighting skill, the UFC fighter outmatches Leatherface in every way, because Leatherface is not a trained fighter. He's just a psychopath murderer. You know what I mean? He's completely insane. He goes around killing everyone, and of course cuts their face off when he's killed them and wears their face as a mask. And he's probably a bit retarded as well. I don't mean that in a comical way. I bet Leatherface is a bit, you know, retarded. And obviously that's what Leatherface is. However, Leatherface is really dangerous. He's a very dangerous murderer in the horror movie franchise. I'm not denying that. I'm not trying to say he's weak. He's far from weak. He's very dangerous. And he goes for cheap shots as well, especially when he gets the chance. You know, Leatherface won't identify he's behind you. If he's behind you and you're not looking at him, he'll just straight hammer you or axe you or chainsaw you. You see that in the 2003 movie as well. Anyway, so I do believe the odds would be in the UFC fighter's favour. Now let's say it's a 1v1. It is a 1v1. And let's say this fight took place on an open field. And the UFC fighter's fully ready, he's fully ready to go. Leatherface doesn't have any weapons, he's just bare hands. Leatherface is going to get his ass kicked. He's going to get his head kicked in, isn't he? Because the UFC fighter is just trained, he's a heavily trained fighter, and all the kicks and jabs and elbows he can deliver are going to knock Leatherface around. Now, let's say it comes to an open field and Leatherface has his hammer with him. Don't have his chainsaw with him or any other weapon, he just has his hammer. This is where it could play out a little differently. However, I still believe even then the odds would be in the UFC fighter's favour, because you got to remember, UFC fighters aren't just good at punches and kicks and things like that. They're also really good at dodging. So if Leatherface comes at him swinging at him with a hammer, you got to remember, the UFC fighter will be really good at dodging that attack, and also he'll be really good at trying to grab it, grappling him, disarming him, and even using the hammer on Leatherface to kick his ass with it. But what if it comes to Leatherface with his chainsaw in an open field? Now, this is where I feel the UFC fighter probably won't fight him head on. He'd probably maybe retreat a bit, because you've got to remember, the UFC fighter, yeah, would be good at dodging, but a chainsaw that's turned on, and even if it's not turned on, you know, you see Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre films use his chainsaw sometimes when it's not turned on. He just uses it as generally a melee stabbing weapon, like, you know what I mean? So, even if it's turned on or not, it can still inflict some serious damage on the UFC fighter. So I do strongly believe, I don't know who the odds in favour there, because I don't believe the UFC fighter would probably fight him head on there. I think he'd maybe run a bit, maybe try and lose Leatherface, if you know what I mean, and then maybe try and sneak up behind him. I mean, I do believe the UFC fighter might try to tackle him head on, but it's just one wrong move and he dodges one wrong chainsaw, he's going to get hit with a chainsaw in the chest or arm or neck, and he's going to be killed. So I feel it's more 50-50, because if the UFC fights him head on, as he's coming up with him with a chainsaw, catches him with an elbow, drops the chainsaw, could grab the chainsaw, use it on him. If Leatherface goes for a chainsaw attack and the UFC fighter fails to dodge it and he hits him clean in the chest, it's going to really, really, really hurt the UFC fighter, or even just straight kill him. It might kill him stone dead. You know, but even if it don't kill him stone dead, he'll still be on the floor bleeding out and won't be able to do much to escape Leatherface's next attacks. So, I do believe the odds would be in the UFC fighter's favour, though. I feel the UFC fighter would win. However, let's do my scenario. So, in my scenario, we have a UFC fighter, his wife, and son. They're going on holiday, because obviously UFC fighters and many other people like that are quite rich, so they can go on holidays literally all the time they want. So, in my scenario, the UFC fighter, his wife, and his young son, I'll say his son's 10. In what I read, I think his son was like 8, but I'll have him 10 in this. I'll change it, he can be 10 in this. So, they're driving on holiday. You know, they're driving in the car, they're on the way, you know, they're just driving. And as they're driving, you know, they're just talking about what they're going to do when they get there, and they're not paying. The dad, which is the UFC fighter, is not paying attention to the road, and there's spikes on the road, and he doesn't see them. He goes straight over to the spikes. Now, it's not his fault, because it's not his fault he wasn't paying attention to the road. They all wasn't paying attention, you know what I mean? They was all looking at each other, kind of looking at the road, then looking at each other, talking about what they're going to do on holiday, because they was excited, you know what I mean? So I'm not just putting the blame on him. It's everyone's fault. You know, they weren't paying attention, and they didn't notice the spikes that Leatherface had put on the road to capture unexpected victims. So they go over the spikes, and 3 of the tires are slashed. Immediately, they get out and they go investigate the damage. The wife is about to get out the car too, but they don't all get out, They don't all get out. The UFC fighter, which is the dad, he's the only one that gets out. His wife is about to get out as well, but he says, no, stay in the car, honey, I'll handle this. So he goes out to see the damage and notices 3 tires have been completely slashed and burst, obviously, you know what I mean? So, he knows he does have some spare tires in the boot, but he only has 2 spare tires. So they can't get back on the road again unless they want to have, well, 1 tire gone, which won't work really well. And if the police see him, they'll pull him over. So what he does is he puts both the new tires on. And for the 4th tire, he thinks, right, I'll ring some sort of gas company. Not gas company. I'll ring some sort of car company. You know, there's loads of car companies out there, like AA or Green Flag, many companies that can come and help you. I'm not sure if they can help you put a tire on, but in this scenario, I'm just going to say they can, just so I can actually have that part in the scenario. So he's looking at the 4th tyre and he's thinking, right, I need to pull my phone out and ring some sort of company to drive out here and give us a new tyre, you know, help us put a new tyre on. Or maybe see, or he does actually think as well, can I ring one of my friends? I mean, I know I'm kind of very far out of their way, but can I ring someone I know that could come drive down here and give me a spare tyre, things like that, you know. Because in those scenarios, you do think like that. You do think, should I ring a company? Can a company come out, some sort of car company, come out here and help me get a new tyre now? Or should I ring one of my friends, things like that. So he's thinking of what to do, and he's looking at the tyre. Leatherface is approaching. Leatherface comes up behind him, his wife screams, the UFC fighter's like, what? And Leatherface, right on the back of the head with a hammer. Not killing him, knocking him out. Cleanly knocks him out. His wife screams, jumps out the car and tries to fight Leatherface. Now his wife, not being a really strong woman, you know, she's just quite average strength, if you know what I mean. And Leatherface is obviously a really big, broad guy, you know what I mean. And I'm pretty sure Leatherface, to be fair, I'm not sure I don't mean he's gigantically overweight, but Leatherface does have a lot of body weight on him as well. So Leatherface is easily able to just subdue her, knock her out, and tie her up. Ties her up by hands and feet, and he's knocked out as well. The son, Leatherface, uses chloroform. Now, I know it's maybe not something Leatherface would do. When I was writing this, I didn't really know if I wanted to have a child violently hit over the head. You know what I mean? I just kind of wanted to leave that. I mean, you know, it's my scenario, so instead of the 10-year-old son being knocked out, I just thought maybe, let's say, Leatherface has some chloroform. He probably wouldn't in real life, but this is my scenario, and I'm just adding that on because I didn't really want to. Now, I might add in future versus matches, you know, a kid being seriously knocked out, but I just feel in this one it's not something I wanted to add. So I just thought Leatherface has chloroform and he makes the kid pass out with that, you know, puts it around his mouth and the kid passes out. So Leatherface takes them all to his house, his torture chamber. Now, of course, he takes the wife and son first and then comes back for the UFC fighter. Now, his house isn't far away, so Leatherface doesn't have to worry about that. So, I'm going to do part 2 in a minute. Just one sec. Okay, guys, I'm back. So, now we'll continue from where we left off. So, the UFC fighter wakes up. He wakes up dazed and confused, heavily concussed. He forgets for a minute where he is or what he had been doing. He tries to get up, but he realizes he's chained down. He's chained down on his forearms. He's also chained down by his legs as well. He notices, though, that the left chain is a bit loose. Now, not loose where he can escape, at least not yet, but he notices the chain is very loose because Leatherface has tortured millions and killed millions of people in here, chaining them down. Now, after years of killing people, the chains have started to wear away, but Leatherface, being, well, kind of a dumbass, hasn't really realized that. but it's not loose where he can get out. But he notices it is a bit loose. He tries to see if any of the others are loose, tries to move, but he's chained down. He looks over to his right, and he sees his wife is hung up by her neck, dead. Tries shouting her, but no response. She's been killed. Nothing he can do about that now. Not Leatherface. The UFC fighter also looks around at his other surroundings. He looks left, he looks in front of him, and he sees loads of different types of torture equipment. There's knives, axes, different types of blades, scalpers, and everything. You know, Leatherface has tortured everyone, millions of people, in any way possible. This guy is horrified. The UFC fighter thinks he's going to die now. You know what I mean? He doesn't know where his son is. He doesn't know where Leatherface has taken him. And he notices to his right as well, there's a giant freezer. Obviously, the Leatherface stores body parts in there. And he also notices loads of human masks hung up on the ceiling that are hooked down, that Leatherface can grab. I mean, they're not hooked down, like, right towards his face so he can, like, literally touch them with his head, if you know what I mean. They're hooked really high in the air, but Leatherface kind of like, I did a thing with, like, Leatherface hook, kind of like a fair where he'd hook them down, like, and then put it on, if you know what I mean. I just do it in different ways. Leatherface can be a sick bastard, you know what I mean? Anyway, so of course, the UFC fighter does everything he can to escape, but just can't. Unfortunately, his wife has been killed. He doesn't realise at first, but when his eyes adjust, because it's not pitch black in the torture chamber, but it is very, very dim, decently dark. But not the type of dark where you can't see anything, no. But it is decently dark in there. He realises when his eyes adjust to his surroundings, his wife has no face. Leatherface has cut her face off. She's gone, obviously. All of a sudden, the UFC fighter hears a door open and heavy footsteps coming down the stairs. Leatherface comes down, wearing his wife's face. He removes it and hangs it up. The UFC fighter is screaming abuse at him, screaming he'll kill him if he gets out of here. The UFC fighter wants to get him so bad, you know what I mean? The UFC fighter knows if he wasn't chained up, the UFC fighter knows if he wasn't chained up, he'd kick his ass, he'd obliterate Leatherface. But fortunately, there's nothing much the UFC fighter can do. He's chained up. But Leatherface goes to his torture table. There's loads of different blades and axes and everything. Leatherface picks up a little rusty axe, approaches the UFC fighter. Now, you've got to remember, the UFC fighter is chained up by his forearms. Like, I'd say the left arm is like here. However, the right arm is more on his elbow. We're chained up there, you know what I mean? UFC fighter grabs his right arm, holds it down, and chops his thumb, the UFC fighter's thumb off. Then chops all his other fingers off. The UFC fighter is screaming in agony. All his fingers on his right hand have just been cut off. Leatherface puts them into a jar and puts them in the freezer. No, don't put them in the freezer yet. Leatherface puts them in a jar. Sick guy does things like this all the time. Leatherface puts his fingers in a jar. The UFC fighter is screaming in agony, but there's nothing he can do. Then Leatherface comes over him again, holds his arm down, and chops his hand off. The UFC fighter has just lost his right hand, losing blood, and he's screaming in agony, as you would be, doing everything he can to move and try and get out, but there's nothing he can do. He's chained down. Leatherface picks up the hand, puts it in the jar, and then places it in the freezer. Leatherface then goes upstairs again, closes the door behind him. The UFC fighter is in agony, just lost his right hand. And of course, screaming in agony, being in all that pain, he is moving so much. You know, he's been doing everything he can to break free. And the left chain has broken. Because the left chain was already slightly damaged because of millions of people that Leatherface has been torturing down here. The chains have worn away. But the left one has worn away the most. And obviously, in his screaming in agony moments of really trying to move and do everything he can to get out, because you would be if you were screaming in agony, you'd be moving all over the place, wouldn't you? The left chain has broke. The UFC fighter didn't even realize at first. It took the UFC fighter at least a good 10 seconds of them realizing, wait a minute, As I'm screaming in agony and moving, I'm moving my hand perfectly. Looks left and the chain is broken. However, he's not free yet. He may have one hand free, but the hand that's been severed is still tied down by a chain, and his feet are still tied down by chains also. But one hand is completely free. Now this is his left hand. His left hand has under no damage to it. It's not been cut off. It's not had anything done to it by Leatherface. At least not yet. So he knows he can drop a nasty punch or an elbow to Leatherface, but he's got to time this just right. So the UFC fighter knows Leatherface doesn't know his left hand has broken out of the chain. He doesn't know that. The UFC fighter knows Leatherface doesn't know. So he knows he's got to play it cool. He's got to time this just right. You know, if Leatherface comes down, he can't just be like, hey, I got my hand free, I'm going to punch you. Because Leatherface will just immediately just get him with a chainsaw or anything else he's got from a distance. That way he can't risk getting punched. So the UFC fighter knows he's got to time this just right. He notices on Leatherface's waist, he had also a little belt on. A belt that contains the keys for the chains. And also he had loads of other weapons on there. Knives and axes and things like that. And also severed fingers and also previous severed faces. All on a little belt. Now this is a thing I added to Leatherface. So it's like a belt of sick weapons, you know what I mean? And he also keeps the keys on his belt to the chains too. But the UFC fighter can't just think, oh, I'll quickly grab him when he walks in. No, because then he'll get killed. He's got to time this just right. The door opens again. Leatherface is walking down. The UFC fighter puts his hand back on the chain. Don't put it like, don't like fasten it down. Obviously, he can't do that because his hand's gone. He just puts his hand under the chain. You know, he scoops his hand under it and leaves his hand under the chain to make it look like he's still chained up. He doesn't want to give away his hand. His left hand is free. He doesn't want to give that away. Because if Leatherface sees that, he'll just kill him immediately. He plays it cool. He pretends he's still chained up and just lies there, you know, in pain. Like, I'm still chained up. Damn it. I mean, he didn't announce he's chained up. Sorry, he's just like, he's still in. He's obviously he's not pretending he's in pain. He is still in pain, but he doesn't show that he's free. I mean, not free. He doesn't show that his left hand's free. He just lies there and just goes with it. He acts natural and just acts like he's going to accept his fate from whatever Leatherface is going to try and do to him now. Leatherface comes down, approaches him again. The UFC fighter knows he's only got one shot at this. He's got to time this just right. He slowly moves his hand away from under the chain. Really slow, like, in a really low-key kind of way. Leatherface isn't actually looking at him right now. He's looking at his torture table. He goes up to have a look at what weapons he could use, but then settles with his chainsaw. He goes and opens a cupboard in the torture room, picks up his chainsaw. The UFC fighter's hand's fully free, but he's still got it laid flatly on the table, so Leatherface won't see it. He comes up to him with a chainsaw. One rev, doesn't start the chainsaw. Just about to do the second rev, and then the UFC fighter elbows Leatherface clean in the nose. But before Leatherface can fall back, he grabs Leatherface, pulls down his head, and bites Leatherface's nose as hard as he can, and he will not let go. Leatherface is screaming in agony, screaming in so much pain. Because you gotta remember, Leatherface has just been dazed by an elbow, and the UFC fighter is also biting his nose. He will not let go. He's sinking his teeth so deep into his nose. Leatherface is screaming in agony, doing everything he can to get away from his teeth. You know, pulling back, punching the UFC fighter, doing everything he can. But the UFC fighter won't let go. He's biting Leatherface's nose, and he's also got his left arm that's free around his head, not allowing him to escape. Does not let go. Waits until, you know, he really viciously is attached to his nose, really biting it. And then, with a quick flash, he lets go. Leatherface falls back, and as he falls back, he grabs the keys that are on his sick torture chamber belt, and the keys fly off. Leatherface has fallen to the ground. He's just been dazed by a massive elbow from the UFC fighter, and his nose is heavily ripped, damaged, and bleeding everywhere. Because the UFC fighter has just sunk his teeth into it. He's got to fight dirty. He needs to do everything he can to escape. As Leatherface is on the floor screaming in agony, he uses the keys to unlock the hand on the right arm, where his fingers and hand have been removed, which he's still losing a lot of blood and he's in pain for that, and he quickly unlocks the chains are tied to his feet. The UFC fighter gets up, but as he gets up, Leatherface is up. Leatherface doesn't pick up his chainsaw, but picks up a hammer. The UFC fighter looks at the weapons, but doesn't pick one up. With just one hand, he kind of is in a fighting position, and he's waiting for Leatherface to make his move. Now they're both 3 feet away from each other, looking at each other, and Leatherface is pissed. He's just been dazed by a massive elbow, and his nose is practically gone. Leatherface has his hammer, and he's ready to do an attack. The UFC fighter is just waiting to do everything he can to try and dodge the attack, and maybe get a new punch or a new elbow in there. He's doing everything he can. His anxiety is pounding out of his chest, and so is Leatherface. Leatherface, in the years he's been torturing people, has never had anyone escape and deliver damage to him the way this UFC fighter just did. Because you've got to remember, Leatherface didn't know this was a UFC fighter. He probably didn't even know what a UFC fighter is. He probably doesn't even care, but he knows he's just been rocked by a massive elbow and had his nose literally bitten clean off. Leatherface comes straight at him with it. He tries to hit him clean in the face, but the UFC fighter moves, grabs the hammer, and they both fall to they're both grappling, doing everything they can. Now, the UFC fighter is becoming outpowered because he's only got one hand. He can't put any strength in with his other hand. It's been removed. So the UFC fighter thinks, use my shoulder. So Leatherface moves, pushes the UFC fighter back to the table, bashes his lower spine on the table. The UFC fighter screams in pain. Leatherface is outpowering him because he can't use his other hand for power. But then he notices, I can use my shoulder. He moves deeply to his right, so he can use his hand and his shoulder for power. Then he starts outpowering Leatherface. Shoulder barges Leatherface right into the back other end of the table, smashing his lower spine off it. Leatherface screams in agony too. Then the UFC fighter catches him with an elbow with his right hand, because of course his hand and fingers are gone, but not his elbow. So he catches him with another elbow, stunning Leatherface. Then they both fall to the ground with the UFC fighter on top of him. The UFC fighter has got the hammer in one hand, and he's just pressing it down as hard as he can on Leatherface's throat. He wants to try and strangle him, but his right hand's gone, so he can't do anything like that. He's just pressing it down as hard as he can. Leatherface is dazed from the second elbow he just took. But obviously, in all the struggling, they've been bashing into tables, and all the weapons from the torture table have all fallen to the floor. So there's weapons and knives and blades all scattered around the area. Leatherface grabs one of the weapons in desperation. Doesn't care what weapon it is, but he grabs it. He grabs a knife, not even realizing he has a knife, and sticks it right in to the UFC fighter's back. This looks like it could be all over for the UFC fighter now. The UFC fighter screams in pain and falls back onto his back, onto his left, and does everything he can to grab the knife and pull it out. But the UFC fighter's just been stabbed in the back. It's nothing but bad news from there. He's in a lot of pain. His hand's gone, and now he's going to lose even more blood because he's just been stabbed in the back. However, Leatherface hasn't straight jumped up and got to his feet and picked up a weapon. No, Leatherface is still on the floor as well. Got to remember, Leatherface has had most of his Got to remember, Leatherface has had most of his nose bitten off, 2 vicious elbows, and has been bashed into a table. So Leatherface isn't jumping straight to his feet all active. No, Leatherface is still on the floor, trying to get undazed and get himself together. He's crawling towards his chainsaw, doing everything he can. He picks his chainsaw up and he sits up, but he doesn't get up, he just sits up. In his dazed mess that he's in with all the elbows he's just taken, he tries starting it up. He wants to just kill this UFC fighter now. He wants to just have this done. You know what I mean? He didn't realise what a skilled fighter this person was. And he didn't realise he was able to escape, you know what I mean? He didn't check the chains. Leatherface, being kind of an idiot, didn't really do that. Quickly, Leatherface is doing everything he can to get the chainsaw started. He manages to get the chainsaw started, but he's so dazed, but he still gets back to his feet. The UFC fighter is still on the floor. He's lost his hand and he's losing blood from his back. The UFC fighter has picked up the knife. The knife that he got out of his back, he's still got it in his hand, and he's got it behind his back. And he's he's not pretending he's in agony, but he's pretending he don't have any weapon on him. He's pretending his left arm is behind his back because he's just trying to cover the blood, which he is doing at the same time. But he's not just doing that. He's got a knife and he's ready. He's ready. This is the UFC fighter's last stand now. This is his last stand. He's got to do something. Leatherface approaches him with a chainsaw. And as he's just about to go down with a chainsaw right into the UFC fighter's chest, the UFC fighter sticks it right in Leatherface's ribs. Leatherface drops the chainsaw. It's heading right for the UFC fighter. The UFC fighter just moves, and the chainsaw is on the floor, spazzing out, going everywhere, cutting holes in the floor and everything. The UFC fighter manages to grab the chainsaw, but he doesn't use it on Leatherface. At least not yet. He picks up the chainsaw and just moves and just chucks it away from him because the chainsaw was so close to hitting him. He just wants to get it away from him. Leatherface has not fallen to the floor, but he's collapsed onto his knees because he's got a knife right in his ribs now. The UFC fighter headbutts Leatherface, falls to the floor, and the UFC fighter jumps on top of him. And with his hand that hadn't been cut off, his left hand, he is punching the hell out of him, pounding him with punches. He just will not let up. The UFC fighter will not stop. 10, 20, 30 punches hitting the UFC... No, I'm sorry, not the UFC fighter. 10, 20, 30 punches just hitting Leatherface clean in the face. He will not stop. The UFC fighter is going on a rampage. He doesn't care if he kills Leatherface. Leatherface has just killed his wife. He doesn't know if he's killed his son, and he's just tortured him. He's not going to show any mercy to Leatherface. Because you've got to remember, Leatherface would show no mercy to him. So he's just pounding Leatherface, doing everything he's got. Leatherface has been obliterated. Leatherface now, he's not dead, but he's almost dead. His whole facial structure, every bone that makes up Leatherface's facial structure is broken. Leatherface can't even move his head. The UFC fighter has destroyed his face with vicious punches. The UFC fighter has shown how deadly he can be under the right circumstances. So, the chainsaw that's still turned on, the UFC fighter gets up. Still lost a lot of blood and he's close to passing out. He's got his right hand, not right hand, sorry, his right hand's been cut off. He's got his right forearm that's still, here, over his back that's been cut. He's trying to cover the blood as best he can. He gets up onto his feet, dazed, picks up the chainsaw with it on with one hand and sticks it right through Leatherface's chest, killing him. Leatherface is dead. The UFC fighter has won, but barely. The UFC fighter then opens the freezer, picks up the jar that has his fingers and right hand in it, because he can't have them reattached if he gets to the hospital in time. The UFC fighter opens the big doors, goes upstairs, but just before he goes upstairs, he turns back to look at his wife. He wants to go up and approach her, but he just can't. He can't face seeing his wife with no face. He just can't look at it. He knows what's happened to his wife, and he can't even summon the will to go look. I mean, who could? Seeing a loved one with his face removed, who could do that? It's like Leatherface is some sort of deranged chimpanzee or something. So, he walks upstairs, limping and almost passing out from the blood loss. As he gets up to the top stair, the UFC fighter spews everywhere, in shock and in dazed and just thinking how crazy things have gone. He was going on holiday. He didn't expect this, you know what I mean? He shouts for his son, but he has no reply. He doesn't know where his son is, what Leatherface has done to him. In his limping stage, he checks upstairs. Most of the rooms upstairs are locked. And he bangs on the doors as hard as he can, but he has no response from his son. If his son's in any of them rooms, he won't know. The UFC fighter is losing so much blood and he's so exhausted that he can't even kick any of the doors down. He quickly goes back downstairs, goes into the living room of the house, and notices his phone's there. He's been looking for his son in the living room, but he notices his phone's there. He picks up his phone and calls the police. He rings the police, but before he can get any words out, he passes out from loss of blood. The UFC fighter falls to the ground. However, luckily, I'm actually out of breath doing this. I'm actually trying to act. It feels weird. Anyway, luckily, the UFC fighter did manage to get a hold of the police before he passed out. You know, the police said, "Hello, this is the police. What emergency service do you require?" You know, because usually it's like, you know, ambulance, firemen, police and all that if you ring 999 or 911. So he did manage to get a hold of the police. However, he didn't get any word out because he passed out. The UFC fighter was so exhausted and losing so much blood and being in so much pain, he just couldn't get a word out. The UFC fighter fell to the ground, passed out from being hurt and in pain, injured and loss of blood. The police on the other end are screaming, "Hello, hello, hello." But since they managed to ring him, since the UFC fighter managed to ring the police can track the number and they can track where it's coming from. They track the phone's location. They break in through the door. The door's already wide open. The door's locked, sorry. The police show up to the location, this big torture house. They break in through the door and investigate. They see the UFC fighter on the floor, passed out. They see he's had a stab wound to the back and his hand has been removed. He's still got a pulse. He's still just alive. The ambulance crew come in, take the UFC fighter. He wakes up in the hospital. The police, before they left, searched the house. They searched right down into the bottom basement where they see the deceased body of the sick Leatherface. Leatherface is dead. They search the house and his son is nowhere to be found. They take the UFC fighter off to the hospital. He wakes up in the hospital with a bandage wrapped around his hand. His hand has been reattached, which is good for him. His hand and 4 of his fingers have been reattached. Unfortunately, his smaller finger was unable to be saved, but at least he got his hand and 4 of his fingers back. Well, 3 fingers and 1 thumb. 1 thumb, if you get what I mean. But anyway, the UFC fighter is happy he's alive, and he's happy he's only lost just 1 finger. At least his other hand, at least his hand and 4 of his other fingers were able to be reattached. He's been patched up in the back where he was stabbed, and he's very lucky to be alive. Police question him and ask what the hell happened. The UFC fighter explains everything to the best of his ability, of what happened, where they were going, and what went down. The police believe him, and they've heard the full story. The police then tell him what happened to his son. He's alive, luckily, and he's actually in the same hospital as him. However, his son is in a bad way. His son was left outside. He was nowhere to be found in the house because Leatherface never took him to the house. He took him to the house at first when he brought his wife and son into the house, but he didn't lock his son in the house. He took his son outside, chained him up, and left him outside. He also, with a nail gun, this is a big, in this scenario, it's a big nail gun, let's just say that. He nailed his son's feet to the mud. So he was in a lot of pain, obviously. And obviously it was freezing out there. It was day when they were captured, but they were there. But the UFC fighter woke up during the night. It was a freezing winter night. His son had deep hypothermia. His son didn't freeze to death, but he was very close. His son's hands and feet are damaged. And unfortunately, he's in a coma from going into shock from all the cold and all the pain he suffered with in that 24 hours. The UFC fighter is devastated, but he's also happy that his son's not dead. The UFC fighter in the next week, was released from the hospital. His son is still in the hospital, is in a bad way. The UFC fighter visits his son and stays with him there when he can sleep over on the nights he can every night. I mean, not every night, because he can't stay there every night, because with other people needing to be in the hospital that are actually injured now, he can't always stay there. They don't always have a bed for him. And he always visits his son. And his son, he's going to make a recovery. He's just been very hurt. His son eventually wakes up from the coma that he was in, because he was heavily in shock, and he went into deep shock after what happened. The UFC fighter explains that the mother has been killed and what happened. The kid cries a bit because, of course, the only reason he cries a bit is because he's still in shock as well. He doesn't really know what to think. Then a year goes down. The son has made a full recovery, and they go back to trying to live a normal life. The UFC fighter and his son have a more closer bond now than they did in ever, because this horrifying experience just bonded them close. I mean, I know they didn't spend much time together during this horrifying experience, but they both survived. And throughout a year, and even more in their lives, they talk about the event and talk about how lucky they are to be alive, and how lucky the UFC fighter was to be able to escape and fight back against Leatherface, kill Leatherface. The UFC fighter and his son have a more special bond, knowing that they survived the tragedy that befell them. Unfortunately, his wife didn't, but he managed to survive, luckily. 5 years go by, and his son's grown up a lot more now. A year already went by, and now I've said another 5 years went by. So his son's like 16 or 17. His son's training in early UFC, following in his dad's footsteps. Them two travel the world and do loads of training, and even his son gets to watch his dad still do fights. Even with his pinky finger missing, he can still do UFC. And his son follows in his footsteps too. They both survived an horrific tragedy. And that's where our story ends. That's my scenario. That's the scenario I wrote. That's all been written by me. Nobody else. All by me. So, I really hope you guys enjoyed it. I thought it was really fun to make. Sorry, I've got some in my throat. So, I really hope you guys enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun to make. I really enjoyed doing it. That's my scenario, guys. That's the scenario how a UFC fighter defeated Leatherface. But not without tragedy. He lost his wife, but luckily managed to save his son. That's my scenario. Luckily, well, the police saved his son as well. Sorry, but he tried to save his son as well, but he passed out from blood loss. But anyway, that's my scenario. That's who I think would win. Generally 1v1, I think a UFC fighter would win, and in my scenario, the UFC fighter wins as well. But that's my story. That's my storyline, all written by me, of how a UFC fighter defeated Leatherface. But not without cost. It was a grim fight where both of them took damage. But that's my fight. What do you guys think? Tell me what you guys think of my scenario. Do you like my scenario? Do you think it's cool? Let me know. Is there anything in the scenario you thought was really good and you think I should add on future scenarios? Let me know. That was my scenario, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. I've been wanting to make this for a while, and it was a lot of fun to make. I enjoyed every bit of it. Okay. This is the Red One, signing out. Much loved, as always. Bye-bye.